A farmer stood alone against corporate land grabbers, but the next morning, a military convoy blocked the roads to protect his property. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning frost crunched beneath Harold Townsend's boots as he walked the eastern boundary of his farm. Dawn was just breaking over the distant hills, casting long shadows across fields his family had worked for 4 generations. At 68, Harold still moved with purpose, his weathered face a map of the life he'd built on these 300 acres in central Nebraska. He paused at the old oak that marked the property line, noticing fresh tire tracks cutting through the wet soil. This was the 3rd time this week. Someone was surveying his land again. Harold knelt, his knees protesting as he examined the tracks. Too deep for a regular car, probably one of those fancy SUVs the Meridian Group executives drove when they visited last month. His jaw tightened at the memory. "We're prepared to offer you 3 times the market value, Mr. Townsend," the woman in the expensive suit had said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "You have to understand. This area has been designated for the new industrial park. All your neighbors have already signed." Harold had shown them the door without a second thought. The farm wasn't just land. It was his heritage, his legacy. The place where he'd raised his children, buried his wife Sarah 10 years ago. The place where his grandfather, who fled the Dust Bowl with nothing but determination, had rebuilt a life. A distant rumble drew Harold's attention to the county road. Another convoy of construction equipment was heading toward the Wilson property to the north. Old Bill Wilson had sold out just 2 weeks ago, the first domino to fall. Now Meridian Group owned nearly every farm surrounding Harold's, creating a vice-like grip around his property. Harold's phone vibrated in his pocket. His daughter, Emma. "Dad, please tell me you're reconsidering," she said without preamble. "I just got another call from Meridian's lawyers. They're filing for eminent domain now." "They can't do that," Harold replied, though a knot formed in his stomach. "This is private property. They're not the government. They're saying the industrial park is for public use because of the jobs it'll create. They've got the county commissioners in their pocket." "Dad, this is happening." Harold watched as dust rose from the Wilson farm where bulldozers were already at work. "Not to me, it isn't." "Dad, I'll talk to you later, Emma." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket. When he returned to the farmhouse, there was an unfamiliar black sedan parked in his driveway. A man in a charcoal suit leaned against it, scrolling through his phone. He straightened when he saw Harold approaching. "Mr. Townsend, Michael Reed, Meridian Group." He extended his hand, which Harold deliberately ignored. Reed awkwardly returned his hand to his side. "I understand you've been hesitant about our offers." "Hesitant implies I might change my mind," Harold said. "I won't." Reed's professional smile faltered slightly. "Sir, I've been authorized to increase our offer by another 20%. That would put us at nearly 4 times market value." "The answer's still no." "Mr. Townsend," Reed's voice took on an edge, "you need to understand what's happening here. This project has state-level backing. The industrial park is going to create over 5,000 jobs. The governor himself is supporting this initiative." "Good for him," Harold said, walking past Reed toward his porch. "He can support it somewhere else." Reed followed, his polished shoes unsuited for the muddy farm soil. "This isn't just about you, sir. This is about the economic future of the entire county. Your neighbors understood that." Harold stopped and turned, fixing Reed with a hard stare. "My neighbors made their choice. I'm making mine. We're filing for eminent domain tomorrow," Reed said, his friendly facade evaporating. "You'll get fair market value, not our generous offer, and you'll be forced out within 90 days. Why not take the better deal while it's on the table?" Harold climbed the porch steps, his back to the man. "Because some things aren't for sale." Everyone has a price, Mr. Townsend, Reed called after him. Harold turned at his door. Then you don't know farmers very well, son. This conversation is over. Inside, Harold poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten breakfast with Sarah for 42 years. Through the window, he watched Reed make several angry phone calls before finally driving away, spraying gravel as he accelerated down the driveway. The eminent domain threat wasn't empty. Harold knew that. With enough political pressure and the right judges, Meridian could take his land, offering mere pennies compared to what it was worth to him. His gaze fell on the old shotgun mounted above the fireplace, then to the photo of himself in army fatigues, standing with his unit in Vietnam. He wasn't a violent man, but he understood that some fights couldn't be avoided. Harold reached for his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. Judge Williams, answered a gruff voice. Robert, it's Harold Townsend. A pause. Harold? Must be important if you're calling me at home. It is. Meridian Group is coming after my farm, claiming eminent domain for that industrial park they want to build. Another pause. I've heard about that project. Got a lot of momentum behind it. Robert, we've known each other 50 years. Your father and my father fought in the war together. I'm not asking you to do anything improper, but I need to know what my legal options are. The judge sighed heavily. Legally speaking, if they've got the county commission declaring it a public necessity, you're in a tough spot. Courts tend to side with development in these cases. Harold's heart sank. So that's it? 4 generations of my family's work just gets bulldozed because some corporation wants it? I didn't say that, Judge Williams replied carefully. Eminent domain can be challenged if you can prove the taking isn't actually for public use, or if the process wasn't followed correctly. And there are other avenues. What kind of avenues? Harold, remember Colonel Madison from the VFW? He works in the state attorney general's office now. There have been concerns about Meridian Group. Environmental violations, labor issues, possible corruption. Nothing concrete yet, but maybe enough to slow things down. After ending the call, Harold sat in silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another family heirloom, ticked steadily. Outside, the sun had fully risen on what might be one of his last days on the farm. He wouldn't go down without a fight. That much was certain. The next morning, Harold was up before dawn, as always. He'd spent much of the night making calls, to old friends, to Emma, who was a lawyer in Omaha, to neighbors who hadn't yet sold. By sunrise, he had the beginnings of a plan. He was washing breakfast dishes when he heard vehicles on the gravel driveway. Not just one, several. Heavy vehicles. Through his kitchen window, Harold watched as 3 black SUVs and a police cruiser pulled up. Men in suits emerged from the SUVs. From the cruiser stepped Sheriff Collins, looking uncomfortable in his formal uniform rather than his usual casual attire. Harold dried his hands, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the porch. Morning, Sheriff, he called. Bit early for a social call. Sheriff Collins removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. He'd been 2 years behind Harold in high school. This isn't social, Harold. These gentlemen are from Meridian Group, and they have paperwork to begin the surveying process under the eminent domain filing. Harold remained on his porch, arms crossed. Paperwork doesn't mean they can step foot on my property, Tom. One of the suited men stepped forward. Not Reed from yesterday, but an older man with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone used to getting his way. Mr. Townsend, I'm Richard Keller, Executive Vice President of Meridian Group. We have authorization from the County Commission to conduct preliminary surveys. Sheriff Collins is here to ensure there are no misunderstandings. The only misunderstanding, Harold replied evenly, is you thinking you can take what's mine. Keller sighed with theatrical patience. This is happening whether you cooperate or not. The industrial park will bring unprecedented economic growth to this county. 5,000 jobs, millions in tax revenue. Progress doesn't stop for sentimentality, Mr. Townsend. This isn't about sentiment, Harold said, descending the porch steps. This is about right and wrong, about corporations thinking they can just take whatever they want. Sheriff Collins stepped between them. Harold, please. Don't make this difficult. They have legal authorization. Do they? Harold asked. Because my daughter, she's a lawyer, you know, tells me the eminent domain process requires proper notification, public hearings, and environmental impact studies, none of which have happened. The sheriff glanced uneasily at Keller, whose expression had hardened. Furthermore, Harold continued, I've filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding Meridian Group's business practices and potential violations of state environmental laws. Keller's face flushed red. You're just delaying the inevitable. Our legal team... He was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. A convoy of pickup trucks came into view, kicking up dust as they rolled down the long driveway. Harold suppressed a smile. Right on time. The trucks parked in a semicircle, and from them emerged 24 people. Farmers, ranchers, and townspeople. Harold recognized each face. Neighbors who hadn't sold, friends from church, veterans from the VFW hall, even old rivals who'd set aside differences for this moment. Among them was Emma, who strode forward with a manila folder in hand. Sheriff Collins, she said professionally, I've filed an emergency injunction against Meridian Group's eminent domain claim. She handed him a document. This temporarily halts any action until a proper hearing can be held. The sheriff reviewed the paper, then looked at Keller. Seems they've got legal grounds to stop this for now, Mr. Keller. Keller snatched the document, scanning it with narrowed eyes. This is a delaying tactic, nothing more. Maybe, Emma replied coolly, but it's a legal one. And while we're at it, I've also filed public records requests for all communications between Meridian Group and county officials. Transparency is important in matters of public interest, don't you agree? The implication wasn't subtle. Several of the county commissioners had won their seats with generous campaign contributions from corporations like Meridian. Keller looked at the crowd of locals, then at Harold, his expression calculating. You've bought yourself some time, Mr. Townsend. Nothing more. He turned to his associates. Let's go. As the Meridian entourage retreated to their vehicles, Sheriff Collins lingered. Harold, he said quietly, they won't give up. And they have influence in places you don't. I know that, Tom, Harold replied, but so do I. The impromptu gathering at Harold's farm evolved into a strategy session around his weathered dining table. Maps were spread out, coffee was poured, and voices overlapped as the group debated their next steps. Emma had taken charge, her legal pad filled with notes as she outlined their options. The injunction buys us time, but Meridian will challenge it, she explained. They've got a legal team on retainer that specializes in these situations. We need to be prepared. Frank Miller, who owned the orchard bordering Harold's eastern property line, leaned forward. My cousin works for the EPA regional office, says Meridian's environmental impact statements for their projects are always suspiciously perfect. Maybe we push for an independent assessment. Good, Emma said, jotting it down, and we should request complete soil and water testing before any development plans are approved. Harold watched with quiet pride as his kitchen filled with neighbors who'd come to his aid. Not everyone in the county had sold to Meridian, it seemed. There were still people willing to stand up for something beyond money. Pastor Mitchell, his collar peeking out from beneath a worn flannel shirt, raised his hand slightly. The Historical Society might be interested in this property too. Wasn't this area part of the original homesteading movement? There could be historical preservation angles worth exploring. Harold hadn't considered that approach. My grandfather's original homestead papers are in the attic somewhere. Built the first structures here in 1919. Perfect, Emma said. Historical significance can complicate development plans significantly. The meeting continued for hours, each person offering different resources, connections, or ideas. By evening, they had formulated a multi-pronged strategy to challenge Meridian's takeover. As the group dispersed with assignments and timelines, Harold walked them to their vehicles. The sun was setting, painting the fields in amber and gold, highlighting the contours of land he knew as intimately as the lines on his own face. Emma was the last to leave, lingering by her car. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe we should consider a compromise. If we could get Meridian to preserve part of the farm, maybe the original homestead area, and you could keep living here." Harold shook his head. "That's not winning, Emma. That's just losing more slowly." "It might be the best outcome we can hope for," she said gently. "Meridian has deep pockets and political connections. They can afford to drag this out until you're bankrupt from legal fees." "Then we'll get creative," Harold replied. "Your mother always said Townsends are too stubborn to fail." Emma smiled at the mention of her mother. "She also said you were too stubborn for your own good sometimes." She hugged him tightly. "I'll start drafting our formal objections tonight. Try not to declare war on anyone before I get back tomorrow." After Emma left, Harold sat alone on his porch, watching darkness claim his fields. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders. He wasn't naive. He understood the odds they faced. Corporations like Meridian didn't lose very often, especially not to aging farmers and small-town allies. His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Townsend?" said a female voice when he answered. "This is Rebecca Chen, from the Nebraska Gazette. I understand you're fighting Meridian Group's attempt to take your farm through eminent domain. Would you be willing to share your story?" Harold hesitated. He'd never sought the spotlight. "Mr. Townsend." "I'm still here," he said. "Just surprised anyone's interested." "Corporate use of eminent domain is a growing concern nationwide," she explained. "Your case could highlight important issues about property rights and corporate influence. Would tomorrow morning work for an interview?" After agreeing to meet the reporter, Harold went to bed with a mind too full for sleep. He tossed and turned, thinking of all that had happened and all that was yet to come. The next morning brought another surprise. As Harold fed the chickens, one of the few livestock operations he still maintained, a drone buzzed overhead, clearly filming his property. The Meridian logo was visible on its underside. Harold watched it hover, then continue its survey. They were documenting his land, likely planning where their buildings would go, imagining his home already demolished. The sound of tires on gravel announced Emma's return, along with Rebecca Chen from the Nebraska Gazette. The reporter was younger than Harold expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with a notebook in one hand and determination in her stride. "Mr. Townsend, thank you for agreeing to this," she said, shaking his hand. "And this drone, is it yours?" Harold shook his head. "Meridians, they're getting a head start on planning." Rebecca immediately pointed her phone upward, recording the drone. "Interesting. They're surveying despite the injunction?" "Technically, they're just flying over," Emma explained. "Aerial surveillance isn't explicitly prohibited by our emergency order." The interview moved to the porch, where Harold recounted his family's history on the farm, the initial offers for Meridian, and the escalation to eminent domain threats. "What makes this land worth fighting for?" Rebecca asked. "Many would take the money and retire comfortably." Harold looked out over his fields. "This land tells the story of my family. Every fence post, every building, every acre has our sweat and blood in it. My grandfather survived the Dust Bowl here. My father modernized during the agricultural revolution of the 1950s. I raised my children here, buried my wife here." He paused. "Some things have value beyond money." Rebecca nodded, writing quickly. "And how do you respond to claims that the industrial park would bring desperately needed jobs to the region?" "I'm not against progress," Harold said. "But there's plenty of unused industrial land 15 miles south near the interstate. They want this land because it's cheaper to develop, and because they've already bought most of the surrounding properties. This isn't about jobs, it's about maximizing profits. As the interview concluded, Rebecca promised the story would run in the Sunday edition. "This might draw attention to your fight, Mr. Townsend. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm not looking for attention," Harold replied. "Just fairness." After the reporter left, Emma handed Harold a thick folder. "Our formal objections to the eminent domain proceedings. I've filed copies with the county, the state court, and sent one directly to Meridian's legal department." Harold flipped through pages dense with legal terminology. "Will this work?" "It forces them to address specific procedural and legal issues," Emma explained. "At minimum, it delays things. At best, if the judge is sympathetic, it could derail their entire eminent domain claim." Later that afternoon, Harold drove into town for supplies. At Wilson's General Store, conversations hushed when he entered. Some nodded in greeting, others averted their eyes. Harold felt the divide forming, those who supported his stand and those who believed he was blocking progress in jobs. Martha Wilson, who'd run the store since her husband died, rang up his purchases with a concerned expression. "Harold, heard about your trouble with Meridian. My nephew works construction and was counting on a job with that project. Says it would mean doubling his salary." "I understand people need work, Martha," Harold replied quietly. "But there are other places they could build." "Maybe," she said, handing him his change. "But a lot of folks around here are struggling. Just something to consider." On his way out, Harold noticed a new poster in the window. "Progress for Riverdale County. 5,000 new jobs coming soon." The Meridian Group logo dominated the bottom of the poster. Back at the farm, Harold found a certified letter waiting in his mailbox. Meridian had filed a counter-motion to dissolve the emergency injunction, claiming irreparable economic harm to the county if the project was delayed. A court hearing was scheduled for the following week. That evening, Harold called Colonel Madison at the Attorney General's office, as Judge Williams had suggested. "I've been looking into Meridian," Madison said, his military precision evident even over the phone. "There are some irregularities in their previous projects. Environmental corners cut, zoning variances granted under unusual circumstances, campaign contributions to key officials immediately before favorable decisions." "Can the AG's office intervene?" Harold asked. "Not directly, not yet," Madison replied. "But I'm quietly expanding our inquiry. If we find clear evidence of corruption or environmental violations, that could change the equation substantially." After hanging up, Harold walked his property in the fading light. The spring wheat was coming in nicely in the south field. The apple trees his father had planted were budding. The old oak where he'd carved his and Sarah's initials still stood tall. He wondered if any of it would survive the year. As darkness fell, Harold noticed unfamiliar headlights approaching on the county road. The vehicle slowed near his property line but didn't turn in. After idling for several minutes, it continued on. A warning? Surveillance? Harold wasn't sure, but the message was clear. Meridian was watching. He went to bed that night with his grandfather's shotgun propped against the nightstand. Not that he expected trouble, but in rural Nebraska, preparedness was second nature. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of bulldozers and courtrooms, of Sarah's grave being relocated to make way for a parking lot, of his fields buried under concrete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles in a war he hadn't asked for but couldn't surrender. Harold Townsend was many things, a farmer, a father, a veteran. He was not a man who gave up easily. The Nebraska Gazette's Sunday edition hit newsstands with Harold's story splashed across the front page. Last Stand. Farmer fights corporate giant over ancestral land ran below a striking photo of Harold standing in his fields, the farmhouse that his grandfather built rising in the background. Rebecca Chen's article was thorough, detailing Harold's family history, Meridian's tactics, and the broader implications for property rights across the state. By mid-morning, Harold's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Local TV stations wanted interviews. Radio hosts invited him on their shows. Even a national cable news program had called, interested in featuring his story. "I didn't expect this," Harold told Emma as they sat at his kitchen table, the newspaper spread between them. "I'm not comfortable being the center of attention." "That's exactly why you're the perfect person for it," Emma replied. "You're not fighting for publicity, you're fighting for your home. People can see that authenticity." She tapped the newspaper. "Rebecca did a great job humanizing the issue. This isn't just about one farm anymore. It's about whether corporations should be able to use government power to take private property." Harold glanced out the window, where 3 news vans were now parked at the end of his driveway. "What do I tell them?" "The truth," Emma said simply. "Just like you told Rebecca." The first interview was with KETV from Omaha. Harold stood by the oak tree that marked his eastern boundary, the camera framing him against his wheat fields, swaying in the spring breeze. "Mr. Townsend, why fight this battle when Meridian Group is offering you far more than market value for your property?" the reporter asked. Harold considered his words carefully. "Because there are things money can't replace. 4 generations of my family have worked this land. My wife is buried here. The memories we've made, the legacy we've built. How do you put a price on that? But the industrial park would bring thousands of jobs to a county that desperately needs economic development. Some might say you're standing in the way of progress." "I'm not against progress," Harold replied, echoing what he'd told Rebecca. "But progress should build communities up, not tear them down. Meridian could build their park on vacant land near the interstate, but they chose this location because it's cheaper and easier for them. They're putting profits ahead of people." As the day progressed, Harold grew more comfortable with the interviews, his natural sincerity coming through. By evening, clips of his responses were circulating on social media, drawing support from across the political spectrum. Property rights advocates, environmental groups, and family farm organizations all expressed solidarity. But not everyone was supportive. The local business association released a statement backing Meridian's project, citing the potential economic benefits. Several neighbors who had already sold their land to Meridian gave interviews suggesting Harold was selfishly blocking progress that could benefit hundreds of struggling families. Monday morning brought another certified letter. Meridian had accelerated the court hearing to Wednesday, claiming media manipulation was creating undue bias against their project. "They're getting nervous," Emma said when Harold called her. "Your story is generating sympathy, so they want to fast-track the legal process before public opinion solidifies against them." "Can they do that?" Harold asked. Judge Reynolds granted their request. He's generally pro-development. Emma sounded worried. "We need to be ready. I'm coming out tonight to prepare you for your testimony." That afternoon, Harold received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Green, the county commissioner who had been most vocal in supporting Meridian's project, pulled up in a shiny pickup truck that looked like it had never seen a day of farm work. "Harold," Green said, not waiting for an invitation before mounting the porch steps. "We need to talk." "Commissioner," Harold nodded coolly, not offering his hand. Green had been instrumental in pushing through the initial eminent domain declaration without proper public hearings. "This media circus you've created is damaging our community," Green said, his politician's smile strained. "Investments like Meridian's don't come along every day. This industrial park could transform our economic landscape." "Funny, I thought proper procedure included public hearings before making those decisions," Harold replied. "But you all voted in a closed session, didn't you?" Green's smile faltered. "We followed the law, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to offer you a personal compromise." "I'm listening." Meridian is prepared to create a heritage park as part of their development. 5 acres surrounding your family cemetery, preserving your wife's gravesite. Plus, they'll name their main boulevard, Townsend Way. Your family's legacy would be honored, and you'd still get the generous compensation package. Harold leaned against the porch railing. And all I have to do is stop fighting, withdraw our legal challenges, and walk away from my home. It's more than fair, Harold. Most people in your position wouldn't get any concessions at all. I appreciate you bringing the offer, Commissioner, Harold said evenly, but my answer remains no. Green's face hardened. This isn't just affecting you, you know. Meridian is questioning whether to proceed at all if this drags on much longer. They have other sites in other counties. All those jobs, all that tax revenue, gone because one stubborn old man won't be reasonable. Is that a threat? It's reality, Green snapped. And there's something else you should consider. The county has broad authority on rural road maintenance, water district allocations, property tax assessments. It would be a shame if your continued operation here became more difficult due to administrative oversights. Harold straightened to his full height. Now that sounds exactly like a threat, Commissioner. One I think the State Ethics Board and those news crews at the end of my driveway might find very interesting. Green glared at him, then turned on his heel and stomped back to his truck, spinning his tires in the gravel as he departed. That evening, as Emma helped Harold prepare for the court hearing, he told her about Green's visit. That's blatant intimidation, she said, outraged, and a clear ethics violation. We should report it. It also tells us they're worried, Harold observed. They wouldn't bother with threats if they were confident about winning in court. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I heard from Colonel Madison today. The Attorney General's investigation into Meridian is gaining traction. They found evidence of concerning patterns in Meridian's previous developments, environmental shortcuts, questionable relationships with local officials, possible permit violations. Will it be enough to stop them? Maybe not immediately, Emma admitted, but it adds another layer of complication for them. And time is our ally now. The longer we can delay, the more evidence might surface. They spent hours reviewing potential questions and preparing Harold's testimony. The core of their legal argument was that Meridian's eminent domain claim failed to meet the public use standard required by law. The primary beneficiary would be Meridian itself, not the public. As night fell, Emma left to finalize their court filings, promising to pick him up in the morning. Harold walked his property one last time before bed, a ritual that had become more poignant with each passing day. Near the old barn, Harold noticed something odd, a metallic glint that hadn't been there before. Approaching cautiously, he discovered a small device attached to his fence post. A camera, expertly camouflaged to blend with the weathered wood. Anger flared in his chest. They were spying on him now. Harold considered removing it, but then thought better. If Meridian was watching, let them see a man calmly tending to his land, unintimidated by their tactics. Instead, he continued his evening walk, making a mental note to have Emma contact the sheriff about the unauthorized surveillance. When he returned to the house, he found his front door slightly ajar. Harold froze. He was certain he'd closed it when Emma left. Carefully, he pushed the door open wider. Nothing seemed disturbed in the front room. He moved silently through the house, checking each room. In his study, he found what he was looking for. His desk drawers had been opened, papers shuffled through. The filing cabinet containing his property deeds and family records stood open. Whoever had broken in knew what they were looking for, and they hadn't bothered to hide their intrusion. Harold called Sheriff Collins immediately. "I'll send a deputy out," Collins said, sounding uncomfortable. "But Harold, without evidence of who did this..." "We both know who did this, Tom," the sheriff sighed. "Just be careful, Harold. You're poking a powerful bear." After hanging up, Harold called Emma to warn her, then checked to make sure nothing crucial was missing. The original deed and his grandfather's homestead papers were still there, though they'd clearly been examined. The message was clear. Meridian could reach him anywhere, even in his own home. Harold sat in his kitchen, shotgun across his lap, waiting for the deputy to arrive. He wasn't afraid. Not exactly. But he understood now that this fight would get uglier before it was over. Tomorrow he would face Meridian in court. Tonight, he would guard his home against intruders who believed their money and power put them above the law. The deputy who arrived took perfunctory notes and promised to look into it, but his demeanor suggested Harold shouldn't expect results. After he left, Harold didn't bother going to bed. Instead, he kept vigil in his rocking chair on the porch, watching his fields under the light of a waxing moon. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Just heard from Madison, AG's office expediting their investigation. Hang in there, Dad. We're not alone in this fight." Harold allowed himself a small smile. Perhaps the odds weren't quite as insurmountable as Meridian wanted him to believe. The county courthouse, a limestone building that had stood at the center of Riverdale since 1892, was surrounded by news vans when Harold and Emma arrived. A crowd had gathered on the steps, some holding signs supporting Harold, others promoting the jobs Meridian promised to bring. Harold straightened his tie, uncomfortable in the suit he hadn't worn since Sarah's funeral. Emma gave his hand a reassuring squeeze before they made their way through the throng, reporters shouting questions that Harold ignored as instructed. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Harold recognized many faces: neighbors, friends from church, VFW members. But the front row behind the Meridian legal team was filled with strangers in expensive suits, including Richard Keller and several county commissioners. "Quite a showing," Harold whispered to Emma as they took their seats. "They're trying to intimidate the judge with a display of corporate force," she replied quietly. "Just focus on me and our attorney when you testify." Their legal team had grown overnight. Emma had enlisted the help of Professor James Wheeler, an eminent domain specialist from the University of Nebraska Law School, who had agreed to assist pro bono after reading about Harold's case. The elderly professor, with his bow tie and spectacles, looked unassuming, but had successfully argued before the Supreme Court twice. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Evelyn Reynolds entered the courtroom. Harold had known her father, a fair-minded man who had served as county judge for decades before her. He hoped the daughter had inherited her father's sense of justice. "We're here on the matter of Riverdale County and Meridian Group versus Harold Townsend regarding eminent domain proceedings," Judge Reynolds began. "I'll hear from the petitioners first." Meridian's lead attorney, Jeffrey Hammond, approached the podium. Tall and imperious in a tailored suit, he exuded confidence. "Your Honor, this case is quite straightforward. The county commissioners have declared this industrial development to be in the public interest, creating 5,000 jobs and generating millions in tax revenue. Mr. Townsend's property is essential to this project, which will revitalize our struggling region." He continued, outlining how all legal procedures had been followed and emphasizing the generous compensation offered to Harold. Mr. Townsend's refusal is not just harming himself, but depriving his neighbors and community of desperately needed economic opportunities. The law is clear. When private property is needed for public use and fair compensation is offered, eminent domain is both legal and appropriate. When Hammond finished, Professor Wheeler rose slowly, his slight frame belying the power of his voice. "Your Honor, what we have here is not eminent domain as the founders intended, but the perversion of government power to benefit private interests. The Fifth Amendment allows takings for public use, roads, schools, hospitals, not private industrial parks that primarily benefit shareholders." Wheeler methodically dismantled Meridian's arguments, citing precedents where courts had rejected similar eminent domain claims. He highlighted procedural irregularities in the county's actions: closed-door meetings, abbreviated public comment periods, rushed environmental assessments. "Furthermore," Wheeler continued, "we have evidence suggesting this location was chosen not for public benefit, but for Meridian's convenience and profit. Their own internal documents, which we've subpoenaed but not yet received, would likely show that alternative sites were available but rejected because they would cut into profit margins. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. These are serious allegations, Professor. Do you have evidence to support them? We have filed parallel Freedom of Information requests for communications between Meridian and county officials, which we believe will demonstrate procedural irregularities. Additionally, we've been informed that the State Attorney General's office has opened an investigation into Meridian's business practices. This revelation caused a stir in the courtroom. Hammond was on his feet immediately. This is the first we're hearing of any Attorney General investigation, Your Honor. It's an obvious delay tactic with no bearing on these proceedings. Judge Reynolds raised her hand for silence. I'll hear testimony now. The county may call its first witness. Commissioner Green took the stand, testifying about the county's desperate need for economic development and the thorough process they'd allegedly undertaken before approving the eminent domain action. Under Professor Wheeler's cross-examination, however, he grew flustered when pressed about closed-door meetings with Meridian executives and campaign contributions he'd received from Meridian-affiliated entities. Richard Keller testified next, presenting glossy renderings of the proposed industrial park, complete with tree-lined boulevards and a small area labeled Townsend Heritage Park. We've gone to extraordinary lengths to accommodate Mr. Townsend's concerns, Keller said smoothly. The compensation package is generous, and we're even preserving a portion of his property as a historical marker. His stubbornness is the only obstacle to progress here. When it was Harold's turn to testify, he felt surprisingly calm. He spoke plainly about his family's history on the land, the lack of proper notification about the eminent domain proceedings, and the increasingly aggressive tactics used by Meridian and county officials. Commissioner Green came to my home 2 days ago and threatened me, Harold testified. He said if I didn't accept their offer, the county would make my continued operation difficult through administrative oversights in road maintenance, water allocations, and tax assessments. This caused another stir in the courtroom. Green's face reddened as Judge Reynolds made a note. And last night, Harold continued, someone broke into my home and went through my property records. The same day, Meridian placed surveillance cameras on my property without permission. Hammond objected immediately. Your Honor, Mr. Townsend is making outrageous accusations without evidence. Meridian categorically denies any involvement in any alleged break-in. The judge sustained the objection, but looked troubled. As the hearing progressed, an unexpected interruption occurred. A man in a dark suit entered the courtroom and handed a note to Professor Wheeler, who read it quickly and requested a brief recess to confer with his client. In a small conference room, Wheeler introduced the man as David Larson, an investigator from the Attorney General's office. We've accelerated our investigation based on new information, Larson explained. We've uncovered evidence that Meridian falsified environmental impact reports for this project. The wetlands on the northern portions of these properties are part of a protected watershed, which Meridian's reports conveniently omitted. Emma leaned forward. Is it enough to stop the eminent domain proceeding? Not directly, Larson admitted. But we're prepared to file an injunction based on environmental regulations if necessary. I wanted you to know we're moving forward aggressively. When court resumed, the mood had shifted subtly. Judge Reynolds seemed more attentive to Wheeler's arguments, and Hammond appeared less confident. After final arguments, the judge announced she would take the matter under advisement and render her decision within 3 days. It wasn't the immediate victory Harold had hoped for, but neither was it a loss. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but Emma deftly guided Harold through them to their car. Richard Keller intercepted them before they could leave. This could all be over today, Mr. Townsend, he said, his voice low. Take our final offer, $5 million, the Heritage Park, and a consulting position with Meridian to ease the transition. This is your last chance at a peaceful resolution. Harold met Keller's gaze steadily. "Mr. Keller, some things aren't for sale, not at any price." Keller's polished veneer cracked. "You think you've won something today? This is just the beginning. We have resources you can't imagine, and we will have that land." "That sounds like a threat," Emma interjected, her phone clearly recording. Keller composed himself quickly. "Just stating facts, counselor. See you in 3 days." The drive back to the farm was quiet, both Harold and Emma lost in thought. The appearance of the Attorney General's investigator had been encouraging, but Meridian's resources and determination were formidable. "They're getting desperate," Emma finally said as they turned onto Harold's driveway. "People who feel secure don't make threats." Harold nodded, taking in the sight of his farm, the fields now sprouting with early summer growth, the barn that needed a fresh coat of paint, the house where he'd lived most of his life. How many more sunsets would he see from his porch? "Whatever the judge decides," he said, "we keep fighting." That evening, several of Harold's supporters gathered at the farm, bringing food and moral support. As they shared a meal under the old oak tree, Harold was reminded that regardless of corporate might and political connections, community still mattered in rural Nebraska. The peaceful gathering was interrupted by the arrival of 3 Meridian security vehicles, which parked just off Harold's property. Men with binoculars watched from the road, making no pretense of subtlety. "They're trying to intimidate us," Frank Miller observed, his orchard now the only buffer between Harold's farm and Meridian-owned land to the east. "Let them watch," Harold replied. "We have nothing to hide." As darkness fell and his friends departed, Harold sat alone on his porch, the security vehicles still visible in the moonlight. A battle had been fought today, with no clear victor. The war, however, was far from over. The next morning, Harold awoke to the distant sound of heavy machinery. From his bedroom window, he could see dust rising beyond the Miller orchard. Meridian was bulldozing the Wilson property, despite the pending court decision. Sending a message, Harold muttered to himself as he dressed. Downstairs, his phone was already ringing. It was Frank Miller, his voice tight with alarm. "Harold, they're running a bulldozer right along our property line. They've already taken out part of my eastern orchard, claiming it's in their right-of-way." "I'll be right over," Harold said, grabbing his keys. When he arrived at the Miller farm, the situation was worse than he'd imagined. A section of Frank's apple orchard, trees that had stood for decades, had been reduced to splintered stumps. 2 bulldozers were parked nearby, while a crew of workers marked additional trees with orange spray paint. A Meridian security vehicle idled on the access road, its occupants watching the scene with detached interest. "They showed up at dawn," Frank explained, his weathered face flushed with anger. "Said they were clearing the utility easement for the industrial park. When I told them the easement doesn't extend this far, they produced some county paperwork I've never seen before, authorizing an expanded right-of-way." Harold examined the paperwork. It appeared official, with the county seal and Commissioner Green's signature, but the boundaries described didn't match any previous surveys. "This isn't right," Harold said. "They're pushing boundaries, literally, to see what they can get away with." Harold approached the crew supervisor, a burly man with a clipboard who seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation. "This easement claim is disputed," Harold said firmly. "You need to stop work until the court makes its ruling." The supervisor shrugged. "I just follow orders, mister. Got proper paperwork here." He gestured to the security vehicle. "Any problems, take it up with them." Harold recognized the tactic. The actual Meridian executives were nowhere to be seen, leaving low-level employees to take the heat while they maintained plausible deniability. "At least give me time to call the sheriff," Harold insisted. "If you're in the right, you've got nothing to worry about." The supervisor hesitated, then gestured to his crew to take a break. Sheriff Collins arrived 30 minutes later, looking harried. He examined the paperwork with a frown. "This does appear to be a legitimate county order, Harold," he said. I can't stop them if they have proper authorization. Tom, look at the date on that order, Harold pointed out. It was signed yesterday after our court hearing. They're trying to establish facts on the ground before the judge rules. Collins looked uncomfortable. I'll check with the county clerk about the proper procedure here, but in the meantime, they have paperwork that seems in order. And by the time you sort it out, more trees will be gone, Frank said bitterly. As they argued, Emma arrived with Professor Wheeler, who immediately began photographing the scene and the documentation. This is a clear attempt to circumvent the legal process, Wheeler declared. I'm calling Judge Reynolds directly. While Wheeler made his call, Harold noticed activity at the security vehicle. A familiar figure emerged, Michael Reed, the Meridian representative who had first approached him. Reed crossed the field toward them, his polished shoes already gathering mud. Gentlemen, Reed nodded coolly. Is there a problem? You know damn well there's a problem, Frank snapped. You're destroying my orchard based on a dubious easement claim while a court decision is pending. Reed's expression remained neutral. The easement work is unrelated to the eminent domain case. We're simply preparing infrastructure for the portions of the project that are already approved. Bulldozing mature apple trees for an easement that didn't exist until yesterday? Harold challenged. Reed shrugged. Development requires sacrifice. Mr. Miller will be compensated for any legitimate losses. Before Harold could respond, Wheeler returned, his expression triumphant. Judge Reynolds has issued an emergency stay, the professor announced. All Meridian activities are to cease immediately pending her final ruling. Sheriff, you'll be receiving the official order momentarily. Reed's composure slipped for a second before he recovered. We'll comply with any court order, of course, but this only delays the inevitable. As the bulldozers withdrew and the crews departed, Harold surveyed the damage. Nearly an acre of Frank's orchard was destroyed. Trees that had taken decades to mature, gone in minutes. They're getting bolder, Emma observed quietly. This isn't just about your farm anymore, Dad. They're sending a message to everyone who stands with you. Harold nodded grimly. They want to show that resistance is costly. That evening, an emergency meeting was held at Harold's farm. The group had grown, now including not just neighboring farmers but also environmental activists, historical preservation advocates, and concerned citizens from town. Rebecca Chen from the Nebraska Gazette was there too, documenting everything. Professor Wheeler updated them on the legal situation. Judge Reynolds was not pleased with Meridian's actions today. It may have actually helped our case by demonstrating their disregard for due process. But the damage is done, Frank Miller pointed out. Those trees won't grow back, no matter what the judge decides. We need to be prepared for more aggressive tactics, Emma advised. Meridian has shown they're willing to push boundaries. Everyone should document everything. Set up security cameras if you have them. Keep your phones ready to record any encounters. David Larson from the Attorney General's office called during the meeting with an update. Emma put him on speakerphone. We've obtained internal Meridian emails through a subpoena, he reported. They explicitly discussed choosing this location because environmental regulations would be easier to navigate with cooperative local officials. We're expanding our investigation to include several county commissioners. This news energized the group. If county officials were implicated in improper conduct, it could undermine the entire basis for the eminent domain claim. As the meeting concluded, Harold walked his supporters to their vehicles. The sunset painted the farm in golden hues, casting long shadows across fields that had sustained his family for generations. The beauty of it struck him anew, reinforcing his resolve to protect this land. Rebecca Chen lingered, notebook in hand. Mr. Townsend, do you mind if I ask a personal question? Harold nodded, curious. What would Sarah think about all this? Would she want you to fight so hard, at such risk? The question caught him off guard. Few people asked about Sarah anymore. Sarah understood what this land means, he said finally. She was a city girl when we met, came from Lincoln to teach at the local school. At first, she didn't understand why anyone would choose this hard life when there were easier paths. He smiled at the memory, but she came to love it as much as I do. The connection to the seasons, the honesty of the work, the legacy we were maintaining and building. He looked toward the small family cemetery where Sarah rested. She'd be right beside me in this fight, probably leading it, to tell you the truth. Sarah never backed down from what was right. Rebecca nodded, making notes. One more question. Meridian's final offer, $5 million. That's life-changing money. What makes this land worth more than that to you? Harold considered the question carefully. You can't put a price on purpose, Ms. Chen. This land isn't just dirt and crops to me. It's where I found my purpose in life. It's where I raised my daughter, loved my wife, honored my father and grandfather's work. If I sold it for any amount, I'd be selling a piece of my soul. After everyone left, Harold sat alone on his porch, watching darkness claim his fields. The stars emerged in the vast Nebraska sky, the same stars his grandfather had navigated by, that his father had taught him to identify on summer nights like this. Tomorrow would bring Judge Reynolds' ruling, a major battle in this ongoing war. Harold had no illusions about Meridian giving up, regardless of the outcome. They had too much invested, too much at stake to retreat over one legal setback. His phone chimed with a text from Emma. Just heard from Wheeler. He's optimistic about tomorrow. Get some rest, Dad. Big day coming. Harold tried to take her advice, but sleep proved elusive. As midnight approached, he noticed headlights on the county road. The now familiar Meridian security vehicles making their rounds, keeping watch on the man who dared to stand against them. Watch all you want, Harold murmured toward the distant lights. This land has outlasted stronger storms than you. Judge Reynolds' decision arrived via courier at dawn, a thick envelope delivered to Harold's front porch. He stood there in his robe, coffee mug in hand, staring at the official seal of the county court. Inside was the document that might decide the fate of everything he held dear. Harold called Emma immediately. It's here. Don't open it, she instructed. I'm 20 minutes away. We should review it together. Those 20 minutes were among the longest of Harold's life. He showered and dressed, trying to prepare himself for either outcome. By the time Emma's car pulled up, he had achieved a semblance of calm. Emma, Professor Wheeler, and Frank Miller gathered around Harold's kitchen table as he finally opened the envelope. The document inside was dense with legal terminology, which Emma scanned rapidly, her expression giving nothing away. Well? Harold asked, his patience exhausted. Emma looked up, her face breaking into a smile. She ruled in our favor. The eminent domain claim is denied. Relief flooded Harold's body, so intense he had to grip the table for support. Frank clapped him on the shoulder, his weathered face alight with victory. Professor Wheeler, however, maintained his professional reserve as he reviewed the document more thoroughly. A qualified victory, he cautioned. Judge Reynolds ruled that Meridian and the county failed to follow proper procedures and didn't adequately demonstrate the public use requirement, but she's leaving the door open for them to refile with a more comprehensive case. So this isn't over, Harold said, his momentary elation dampening. No, Wheeler confirmed, but it's a significant setback for them. They'll have to restart the entire process, conduct proper environmental studies, hold public hearings, all of which will take months, possibly years. Emma reached for her father's hand. It's a win, Dad. Maybe not the final one, but an important victory nonetheless. Harold nodded, trying to recapture the initial surge of relief. What happens next? Meridian will almost certainly appeal, Wheeler explained, and they'll likely try to address the procedural issues Judge Reynolds identified so they can refile the eminent domain claim. But in the meantime, they cannot legally take any action toward claiming your property. The professor's phone rang. After a brief conversation, he turned to the group with a troubled expression. "That was my contact at the county clerk's office. Meridian has already filed notice of appeal, and they've submitted revised paperwork addressing each of the judge's concerns. They're not wasting any time." "Of course not," Harold said grimly. "They've got too much invested to back down now." As they discussed next steps, Harold's phone buzzed with text messages from neighbors and supporters who had heard the news. The local radio station was already reporting on the decision, and Rebecca Chen wanted a statement for an online update to her article. By mid-morning, the mood at the farm had shifted from cautious celebration to strategic planning. The victory had energized Harold's supporters, but Meridian's immediate response made it clear the fight was far from over. Around noon, a convoy of vehicles approached, not Meridian's sleek corporate SUVs, but pickup trucks and family cars bearing Harold's neighbors and allies. They poured into his yard, carrying dishes for an impromptu potluck celebration. Martha Wilson, who had been cool to Harold in her store, arrived with a casserole and an apology. "I should have supported you from the start," she admitted. "My nephew can find work elsewhere. Some things matter more than money." As the gathering gained momentum, someone erected a banner between two trees. "Townsend stands strong." Harold, unused to being the center of attention, found himself moved by the community's support. These were the people who made this land worth fighting for. Not just the soil and buildings, but the human connections forged over generations. The celebration was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Collins, his expression grave as he approached Harold. "Sorry to break up the party," Collins said quietly, "but I thought you should know. The county commissioners have called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Word is they're planning to invoke a rarely used statute allowing for temporary seizure of property during appeals in cases of compelling public interest." Harold felt the ground shift beneath him. "Can they do that?" "It's a legal gray area," Collins admitted. "The statute dates back to the 1940s, intended for wartime emergencies. I'm not sure it applies here. But Commissioner Green is pushing hard." Emma, overhearing, joined the conversation. "That statute was ruled unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court in 1987, she said firmly. "Green claims this is different," Collins replied. "I'm just giving you a heads up because it's the right thing to do." After the sheriff departed, Emma immediately called Professor Wheeler and David Larson at the Attorney General's office. The celebration transformed into an emergency strategy session, with legal experts conferring by phone while Harold's supporters pledged to attend the commissioners' meeting en masse. Late that afternoon, as the gathering dispersed, Harold walked the perimeter of his property with Frank Miller, both men lost in thought. "They're getting desperate," Frank observed, pausing to examine the damaged section of his orchard. "That's dangerous?" Harold nodded. "Desperate people make mistakes, but they also take bigger risks." "You know," Frank said hesitantly, "my cousin in the EPA mentioned something about Meridian's other projects. Apparently they have a pattern of moving fast once they get approvals, sometimes starting work before permits are finalized, assuming they can pay fines later if necessary." "You think they might try something like that here?" Frank shrugged. "I'm just saying we should stay vigilant. Judges ruling or not, I wouldn't put it past them to try creating facts on the ground that would be hard to reverse." As if to underscore Frank's warning, they spotted 3 Meridian survey trucks parked on the county road near Harold's eastern boundary, workers with equipment visible in the fields beyond. "Still surveying, even after the ruling," Harold noted. "Or planning something else," Frank replied darkly. That evening, Harold received an unexpected call from Richard Keller himself. "Mr. Townsend," Keller began without preamble, "I'm calling to offer one final opportunity for an amicable resolution." "The judge has ruled, Mr. Keller," Harold replied evenly. "There's nothing to resolve. Judges can be overruled, Appeals can be filed. Statutes can be invoked. This process could drag on for years, costing you far more than just financial resources. Is that a threat? It's reality, Keller said smoothly. Meridian is prepared to offer you $10 million, our absolute final offer. Twice what we proposed before. Additionally, we would preserve 10 acres surrounding your family cemetery as a heritage site and establish a Townsend Agricultural Scholarship at the State University. The sum staggered Harold momentarily. $10 million was more money than his family had earned from the land across all 4 generations combined. Why the sudden generosity? Harold asked, buying time to compose his thoughts. Let's call it recognition of your persistence, Keller replied. Meridian values efficiency. A prolonged legal battle benefits no one. This offer expires at midnight. After ending the call, Harold sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint his fields in gold and amber hues. $10 million would secure Emma's future, could fund charitable causes, could even allow him to buy another farm elsewhere. But it wouldn't be this farm. It wouldn't have Sarah's grave beneath the old oak. It wouldn't have the marks on the barn door showing Emma's height as she grew. It wouldn't have the soil his grandfather had rebuilt after the Dust Bowl, that his father had carefully stewarded through droughts and floods. His phone rang again. Emma. Dad, Sheriff Collins just called me. The commissioners have actually scheduled their emergency meeting for tonight, not tomorrow. They're trying to avoid public scrutiny. We need to get down there now. Harold grabbed his keys. I'll meet you there. As he drove toward town, he noticed unusual activity along the county road. Meridian trucks were positioned at strategic points, each containing surveying equipment and crews waiting. A larger convoy of construction vehicles was parked at the junction with the state highway. They weren't waiting for legal permission, Harold realized. They were preparing to move immediately if the commissioners granted them temporary access. The battle that had started with polite offers and legal filings had escalated far beyond what he had imagined. Tonight would determine whether the rule of law still meant anything in Riverdale County, or whether corporate power could simply override judicial decisions. Harold pressed the accelerator, determination hardening within him. Meridian thought they were fighting one stubborn old farmer. They were about to discover they were fighting an entire community that still believed in justice. The county administration building was eerily quiet when Harold arrived, nothing like the bustling public hearings he remembered from years past. Only a single entrance was unlocked, with a security guard checking IDs against a list. In the parking lot, Harold recognized the vehicles of all 5 commissioners and several Meridian executives, including Keller's distinctive black Escalade. "I'm here for the emergency meeting," Harold told the guard. The man consulted his clipboard. "Your name's not on the authorized list, sir." "It's a public meeting of elected officials," Harold said firmly. "By law, it has to be open to the public." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "I've got my orders, Mr. Townsend." From down the hallway, Commissioner Green emerged, his face tightening when he saw Harold. "It's all right, let him in," Green instructed the guard. "We have nothing to hide." The small conference room was already crowded with men in suits. Meridian's legal team occupied one side, while the commissioners sat behind a folding table serving as an impromptu dais. No provision had been made for public seating, clearly by design. "Where's the court reporter?" Harold asked, noting the absence of the usual stenographer who recorded official proceedings. "This is an emergency session, not a formal hearing," Green replied dismissively. "We're simply considering a temporary administrative action." The commissioners' faces revealed a range of emotions. Green and 2 others looked determined, while Commissioner Rodriguez appeared uncomfortable, and elderly Commissioner Wilson seemed openly conflicted. As Green called the meeting to order, the door opened again. Emma entered, followed by Professor Wheeler, David Larson from the AG's office, and Rebecca Chen from the Nebraska Gazette. Green's face darkened. "This is a closed emergency session," he objected. Actually, it's not, Emma replied calmly, placing a document before him. State sunshine laws explicitly prohibit closed meetings of elected officials, except in narrowly defined circumstances, none of which apply here. This is a cease and desist letter from the Attorney General's office. Green scanned the document, his expression souring further when Larson introduced himself. Furthermore, Larson added, any action taken in violation of open meeting laws would be void and potentially subject those involved to ethics investigations. The door opened yet again as Sheriff Collins entered, followed by a steady stream of citizens, Harold's neighbors and supporters, who had been alerted by Emma's rapid text campaign. They filed in silently, lining the walls of the small room until it was packed to capacity, with more visible in the hallway beyond. Green looked as though he'd swallowed something bitter. Fine. Since we apparently have an audience, let's proceed. The county commissioners are considering emergency implementation of Statute 39-427, which allows temporary access to private property during pending legal disputes when compelling public interest is at stake. Commissioner Rodriguez, a farmer himself before entering politics, spoke up. Tom, I'm not comfortable with this. Judge Reynolds explicitly ruled against the eminent domain claim. Using an obscure wartime statute to circumvent that ruling seems inappropriate. Meridian's lead attorney interjected smoothly. The statute remains valid law, Commissioner, and the public interest in beginning this project is substantial. Every day of delay costs the county potential jobs and tax revenue. The public interest also includes respecting the rule of law, Emma countered. This statute was effectively invalidated by the state Supreme Court in 1987. Invoking it now would expose the county to significant legal liability. Green dismissed her objection with a wave. That's Meridian's legal opinion, not settled fact. We're prepared to test it in court if necessary. At taxpayer expense, Harold added loudly, drawing murmurs of agreement from the citizens lining the walls. The debate continued, growing increasingly heated as Green pushed for an immediate vote, while Rodriguez and Wilson raised procedural concerns. Throughout, Rebecca Chen took notes and recorded the proceedings on her phone, making Green visibly nervous. Finally, Green called for a vote. All in favor of invoking Statute 39-427 to grant Meridian Group temporary access to the Townsend property pending appeal, signify by saying aye. Green and his two allies quickly voted in favor. Opposed? Nay, Rodriguez said firmly. All eyes turned to Commissioner Wilson, the swing vote. The elderly man, who had served on the commission for over 2 decades, looked torn. Gordon, Green pressed, we need to move forward. The county needs this development. Wilson's gaze moved from Green to Harold, then to the assembled citizens. I've known Harold Townsend my entire life, he said slowly. His father helped my family during the drought of '56 when we nearly lost everything. He paused. And I've known you too, Tom. Known how Meridian donated to your last 3 campaigns. Known about the meetings you had with them before any public announcement of this project. Green's face flushed. That's completely irrelevant to... Nay, Wilson interrupted firmly. My vote is nay. I won't be party to subverting a judge's ruling or trampling a man's constitutional rights. A collective exhale seemed to fill the room. The measure had failed, 3-2. Green slammed his gavel down, his composure cracking. This meeting is adjourned, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot. As the room emptied, Harold received handshakes and pats on the back from supporters. Even Sheriff Collins gave him a subtle nod of approval. Outside, however, the victory celebration was cut short. In the parking lot, Richard Keller was engaged in an intense phone conversation, his face grim as he paced beside his Escalade. Something's wrong, Emma murmured to Harold. They had a backup plan. They always do. David Larson approached them, his expression confirming Emma's suspicion. We just got word, he said quietly. Meridian filed emergency papers with the state appellate court this afternoon, seeking to override Judge Reynolds' decision. They've apparently got a friendly judge there, Judge Harrison Morris. Morris, Emma said, her face falling. He's notorious for pro-development rulings. His son-in-law is a lobbyist for several corporate development groups. Should he recuse himself? Harold asked. He should, Larson replied grimly. But he won't. And at the appellate level, it's harder to force the issue. As they spoke, Keller finished his call and approached their group, his confidence fully restored. Enjoy your symbolic victory, Mr. Townsend, he said smoothly. Judge Morris has granted our emergency motion. We'll have his signed order by morning, superseding Reynolds' decision and granting us immediate access pending full appeal. That's impossible, Wheeler objected. An appellate judge can't simply overrule a lower court without proper procedure. Apparently he can, Keller replied. Emergency circumstances, compelling state interest, all the usual justifications. The paperwork is being finalized as we speak. Harold felt a chill run through him despite the warm evening. So that's how it works? You just keep shopping for judges until you find one who gives you what you want? That's how it works when you have resources and determination, Mr. Townsend. Keller's smile was cold. Our crews will be on your property at 7 a.m. tomorrow. I suggest you don't interfere. Judge Morris's order includes explicit penalties for obstruction. After Keller departed, Harold's supporters gathered around him, their earlier elation replaced by disbelief and anger. They can't do this, Frank Miller insisted. It's not right. Right doesn't always prevail, Professor Wheeler said sadly. Not immediately, anyway. Emma was already on her phone, attempting to rally legal countermeasures, but her expression suggested limited options. We can file for an emergency stay from the state Supreme Court, she explained, but it would take days at minimum to be heard. As the group dispersed, plans forming for the morning confrontation, Harold drove home in silence, watching the sunset gild his fields one more time. At home, he sat on his porch, facing the reality that had been looming since Meridian first appeared. They would not stop. They would use every legal maneuver, every political connection, every financial advantage to take his land. His phone buzzed with Keller's final offer, $10 million. Offer expires at midnight. As darkness fell, Harold made his decision. Not out of resignation, but from a deeper place of resolve. There were some fights that couldn't be won conventionally, against enemies with unlimited resources and influence. But that didn't mean surrender was the only option. Harold picked up his phone and began making calls, not to lawyers or politicians, but to neighbors, to veterans from his unit, to people who understood that some principles transcended legal documents and court orders. By midnight, as Keller's artificial deadline expired, Harold had assembled a different kind of defense, one that Meridian, for all its corporate power, might not have anticipated. Dawn broke over Harold's farm with unusual activity. Pickup trucks and cars lined his driveway and the adjacent field he designated for parking. Nearly 100 people had arrived, farmers, veterans, church members, even teenagers from the local high school. They moved with quiet purpose, positioning themselves strategically around the property. Frank Miller had brought a dozen men from the local VFW post, many in their fading military caps. Pastor Mitchell led a group from the church, including elderly women who set up a food station on Harold's front lawn. Students from the agricultural program at Riverdale High School formed a human chain along the eastern property line. Harold stood on his porch, surveying the scene with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. He hadn't asked these people to risk themselves, had only asked for witnesses to whatever happened next. But they had come with more than cameras and cell phones. They had come to stand with him. Quite a gathering, Emma observed, joining her father on the porch. She had arrived with Professor Wheeler and 3 legal observers from a civil liberties organization. More than I expected, Harold admitted. Word spread quickly after last night. Rebecca's article about the commissioners' meeting and Judge Morris's suspicious intervention was shared thousands of times online. Emma checked her watch. It's almost 7. As if on cue, a convoy appeared on the horizon, Meridian's now familiar black SUVs leading a procession of construction vehicles, bulldozers on flatbed trucks, and what appeared to be private security in tactical gear. They're not taking any chances, Harold noted grimly. Sheriff Collins's patrol car arrived moments before Meridian's convoy, positioning itself at the entrance to Harold's driveway. The sheriff stepped out, looking uncomfortable in the morning light, clearly caught between his duty and his conscience. The convoy stopped at the property line. Richard Keller emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by Michael Reed and 2 men in suits Harold didn't recognize. Behind them, a phalanx of private security personnel formed a line, their stance unmistakably intimidating, despite their civilian clothes. "Quite the welcoming committee you've assembled, Mr. Townsend," Keller remarked as he approached the property line. He held up a document. "I have Judge Morris's order granting us immediate access to begin preliminary work. Sheriff Collins has been instructed to ensure compliance." Sheriff Collins stepped forward, his discomfort evident. "Harold, they do have a court order. I'm obligated to enforce it." Harold descended from his porch, stopping several paces from Keller. "I understand you have a piece of paper, Tom, but we all know what's happening here. This isn't justice. It's power using the courts as a weapon." "Nevertheless," Keller interjected smoothly, "the order is legally binding. Your supporters would be wise to disperse peacefully." A murmur ran through the crowd. Frank Miller stepped forward, his Vietnam veteran's cap set firmly on his gray hair. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're here as witnesses, to document everything that happens. And to pray," added Pastor Mitchell, joining them, "to pray that justice and compassion prevail over greed." Keller's polished veneer cracked slightly, irritation flashing across his face. "This is a straightforward legal matter, not a moral crusade. Sheriff, please clear these people from the property so our crews can begin work." Sheriff Collins hesitated, scanning the assembled crowd. His neighbors, people he'd known his entire life, standing shoulder to shoulder in silent resistance. "I need to see that order," Emma said, stepping forward with Professor Wheeler. "As Mr. Townsend's legal counsel." Keller handed over the document with visible reluctance. As Emma and Wheeler reviewed it, David Larson from the Attorney General's office arrived, parking haphazardly and jogging to join them. "That order may be problematic," Larson announced, slightly breathless. "Judge Morris failed to disclose his financial interests in companies affiliated with Meridian Group. The Attorney General is filing an emergency ethics complaint this morning." Keller's expression darkened. "The order stands until formally vacated. We're proceeding as planned." While this legal debate unfolded at the property line, Harold noticed movement to the east. A separate group of Meridian vehicles was approaching through the former Wilson property, attempting to access his land from another direction where fewer protesters were stationed. "They're trying to outflank us," Harold said quietly to Frank, who immediately dispatched several veterans to reinforce that boundary. The confrontation was escalating. Meridian's private security began to advance past the property line, forming a wedge to create space for the construction vehicles behind them. The human chain of students and farmers held firm, linked arm in arm, their phones recording everything. "This is your final warning," Keller announced loudly. "Anyone interfering with our court-ordered access will be subject to arrest and civil penalties." Sheriff Collins looked increasingly torn. "I can't arrest all these people, Richard, and I'm not comfortable using force against peaceful citizens." "That's why we brought our own security," Keller replied coldly. "They're licensed professionals who understand what needs to be done." As tensions mounted, an unexpected sound cut through the morning air. Helicopter rotors. All eyes turned skyward as a news helicopter appeared, circling low enough to capture the entire scene. Below it, a convoy of vehicles approached from the main road, more media outlets, drawn by Rebecca Chen's live updates on social media. Harold sensed a shift in the dynamic. Meridian had expected to overwhelm a small group of protesters with a show of force, conducting their operation with minimal public scrutiny. Instead, they faced a community united in peaceful resistance, with media witnesses ensuring that every action would be visible to the world. Keller conferred urgently with his security team, clearly recalculating their approach. During this momentary lull, Harold heard his phone ring. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered. "Mr. Townsend, this is Governor Lancaster." The familiar voice of Nebraska's governor was unmistakable. "I've been briefed on the situation at your farm. Is it accurate that Meridian Group is attempting to enforce a questionable court order through private security forces?" "Yes, Governor," Harold replied, stunned by the unexpected call. "They're at my property line right now. Please put Sheriff Collins on the phone." Harold walked to the sheriff and handed him the phone. "It's the governor." Collins's expression shifted from confusion to attention as he listened. After a brief conversation, he returned the phone to Harold. "The governor would like to speak with you again, Harold." "Mr. Townsend," Governor Lancaster continued, "I've instructed Sheriff Collins to maintain peace but not to enforce Judge Morris's order until its legitimacy can be properly reviewed. I've also dispatched state troopers to ensure the situation remains peaceful." "Thank you, Governor," Harold said, relief evident in his voice. "Don't thank me yet. This is a complex legal situation that will take time to untangle. But I won't allow private security forces to act as law enforcement in our state, regardless of what court orders they may have obtained." As Harold ended the call, Sheriff Collins approached Keller with newfound confidence. "By order of Governor Lancaster, I cannot enforce this disputed court order at this time. Your security personnel need to stand down immediately." Keller's composure finally shattered. "This is outrageous. We have a valid court order. The governor has no authority to—" "The governor has every authority to ensure public safety and proper procedure in his state," Emma interjected, and given the Attorney General's ethics complaint against Judge Morris, prudence suggests waiting for clarification. Keller looked ready to argue further, but was interrupted by the arrival of state police vehicles, their lights flashing as they approached the gathering. The situation had escalated beyond his control. "This isn't over," Keller stated flatly to Harold. "Not even close." "I never thought it was," Harold replied evenly. As Meridian's convoy reluctantly withdrew, cheers erupted from the assembled supporters. The immediate crisis had been averted, but Harold harbored no illusions about the battle being won. Meridian would regroup, reassess, and return with new tactics. But something fundamental had changed. What began as one farmer's stand against corporate overreach had transformed into a community's defense of cherished values: justice, fairness, respect for rights that transcended money and power. As the crowd celebrated their temporary victory, Harold found himself approached by reporters from every major outlet in the state. "Mr. Townsend, what happens next?" asked a young reporter from a Lincoln station. Harold gazed across his fields, where generations had planted, harvested, endured, and persevered. "We keep standing our ground," he said simply. "Today, tomorrow, and for as long as necessary." The community that had assembled to defend his farm began to organize for the long haul, establishing communication networks, scheduling shifts for ongoing presence, and collecting resources to support what everyone now understood would be a prolonged resistance. Harold Townsend was no longer standing alone, and that made all the difference. By nightfall, Harold's farm had transformed into an organized resistance camp. Tents dotted the front field. Portable toilets had been delivered by a sympathetic local contractor, and a communal kitchen operated from a collection of folding tables. The local cellular provider had even dispatched a temporary signal booster, ensuring that live streams and social media updates could continue uninterrupted. Harold surveyed the scene from his porch, still processing the day's events. What had begun as his personal stand had evolved into something far larger, a symbol of resistance against corporate overreach that was now drawing support from across the state and beyond. Emma joined him, tablet in hand. "You've gone viral, Dad. The image of you facing down Meridian's security team is everywhere. People are calling it the last stand at Townsend Farm." Harold shook his head, uncomfortable with the attention. "I never wanted to be a symbol. Sometimes we don't choose our battles. They choose us," Emma replied. She scrolled through her tablet. "There's more news. The Attorney General's office has formally requested that the state Supreme Court review Judge Morris's order on an emergency basis. And 3 state senators have called for an investigation into Meridian's political contributions and connections. Will it be enough? It's a start, but Meridian won't just walk away. They've invested too much." As if confirming Emma's assessment, David Larson approached them, his expression grave. "We've intercepted communications suggesting Meridian is considering alternative tactics," Larson informed them. "They're discussing potential nighttime operations, using the disputed court order as cover." Harold felt a chill despite the warm evening. They'd risk that kind of confrontation? Their project timeline is already compromised. Delays cost them millions. And they've encountered very little resistance in other communities. This public defiance has them rattled. Larson checked his phone. "The Attorney General has requested state police protection for your property overnight, just in case." After Larson departed, Harold walked among the tents, speaking with supporters, thanking them for their presence. Many had taken vacation days from work to be there. Others had rearranged their lives indefinitely to join what they now called the movement. Frank Miller was coordinating security rotations, ensuring the property perimeter remained observed at all times. "Like old times," he said with a grim smile, referencing their military service. "Except the stakes are actually clearer now." Pastor Mitchell had organized an interfaith prayer circle that included people from various denominations and beliefs. "The moral clarity of this situation transcends political divisions," he explained to Harold. "It's about fundamental justice." As darkness fell, Harold noticed a group of students huddled around laptops, working intently. "What are you all doing?" he asked curiously. A young woman looked up. "I'm Zoe," she said, "environmental science major at UNL. We're mapping the wetlands on your property and adjacent lands, documenting the protected species. It strengthens the environmental case against Meridian's development." Another student added, "I'm coordinating with tribal representatives. There's evidence that this area contains culturally significant indigenous sites that would require extensive archaeological review before any development." Harold was struck by how these young people were applying their education to real-world advocacy, fighting with knowledge and expertise, rather than just passion. Around midnight, with most supporters asleep in their tents, Harold sat alone on his porch. The full moon illuminated his fields, casting long shadows across land that had sustained his family for generations. The beauty of it struck him anew, not just as property to be defended, but as a living legacy deserving of protection. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. But instead of Meridian's menacing black SUVs, these were state police cruisers, positioning themselves discreetly along the property line, the protection Larson had mentioned. Harold finally went to bed around 2 a.m., exhausted but resolute. The battle had evolved beyond anything he had imagined when he first rejected Meridian's offer. What began as one man's stand had become a community's cause, then a regional story, and now, apparently, a national symbol of resistance against unchecked corporate power. The next morning brought news that further transformed the conflict. Governor Lancaster had issued an executive order freezing all development permits related to Meridian's industrial park, pending a comprehensive review of environmental impacts and procedural compliance. "It's not a permanent solution," Emma cautioned as she shared the news with Harold over breakfast. but it buys us valuable time. Richard Keller's response came swiftly. In a hastily arranged press conference outside Meridian's regional headquarters, he denounced the governor's action as political interference in legitimate business activities and announced that Meridian was filing federal lawsuits alleging violations of interstate commerce regulations. Meridian Group remains fully committed to this project, Keller declared to assembled reporters. We have followed all applicable laws and procedures. This obstructionism by a small group of anti-progress activists, enabled by politically motivated officials, will not deter us. But the tenor of media coverage was shifting. Investigative journalists had begun digging into Meridian's history in other communities, revealing a pattern of environmental violations, broken promises about job creation, and political manipulation. The narrative was no longer simply about one farmer's resistance. It had become a story about corporate accountability and the limits of economic development when it trampled individual rights. By mid-afternoon, Harold received a call from an unexpected source. Senator James Bennett, chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee. Mr. Townsend, the senator began, I've been following your situation closely. My committee is considering hearings on the broader issue of eminent domain abuse by private corporations. Would you be willing to testify? Harold, who had never imagined himself speaking before Congress, hesitated only briefly. If it would help protect other farmers from what my family has experienced, yes, Senator, I would. As word spread about the potential congressional hearings, Meridian's public stance began to show subtle signs of adjustment. Keller gave another press statement, emphasizing Meridian's willingness to work with all stakeholders and consider alternative approaches that address legitimate concerns. They're starting to realize this isn't going away, Emma observed. The longer this drags on, the more scrutiny they face, and the more their other projects might be affected. That evening, a new convoy approached Harold's farm. Not construction equipment or security forces, but ordinary cars and trucks bearing families from neighboring counties. They came with food, supplies, and stories of their own struggles against corporate land acquisition. What had started as a local stand was coalescing into a movement that transcended Harold's specific case. As Harold greeted these new supporters, a reporter from a national news magazine approached him. Mr. Townsend, many are calling you a folk hero for standing up to corporate power. How do you see yourself? Harold considered the question carefully. I'm just a farmer who believes some things matter more than money. My land is my heritage. Not just soil and crops, but the story of my family's perseverance. I couldn't sell that heritage any more than I could sell my own soul. And if Meridian eventually prevails in court, what then? Harold looked out over his land, where generations had planted, harvested, struggled, and endured. There's a difference between what's legal and what's right. The courts will decide what's legal. But we already know what's right, and that's what we're standing for. As the sun set on another day of resistance, Harold received word that Meridian's stock price had fallen significantly as investors questioned the wisdom of pursuing a project that had generated such negative publicity. Financial analysts were beginning to characterize the Riverdale Industrial Park as a liability rather than an asset for the company. The balance of power was shifting, gradually but perceptibly. Meridian had expected to overwhelm a single stubborn farmer with their financial and legal resources. Instead, they found themselves engaged in a public relations battle they hadn't anticipated, against a coalition of diverse supporters united by a shared sense of justice. That night, Harold slept more soundly than he had in weeks. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since Meridian's black SUVs had appeared on his property, he felt a genuine sense of hope. Sometimes, it seemed, standing your ground could inspire others to find their own courage, and together they might accomplish what none could achieve alone. 3 months later, Harold stood in his south field, examining the ripening wheat that swayed gently in the late summer breeze. The land looked much as it always had. Productive, peaceful, enduring. But everything else had changed. The sprawling encampment that had occupied his front field for weeks was gone now. The grass slowly reclaiming the packed earth where tents and tables had stood. The constant presence of news crews had dwindled to occasional visits, usually when some new development in the ongoing legal battle emerged. The state police protection had been withdrawn once Meridian formally suspended their immediate operations in the area. But the legacy of those intense weeks remained, visible in ways both subtle and profound. Harold turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. Emma walked toward him, dressed in a professional suit rather than her usual casual attire when visiting the farm. She had just returned from testifying before the state legislature, which was considering new protections for property owners facing eminent domain claims from private entities. "How did it go?" Harold asked, noting the satisfied expression on his daughter's face. "Better than expected," Emma replied. "There's growing bipartisan support for the reforms. The committee chair thinks it will pass before the end of the session." Harold nodded, gratified but not surprised. The coalition that had formed around his case had proven remarkably durable, transcending traditional political divisions and focusing lawmakers' attention on fundamental issues of property rights and corporate accountability. They walked together toward the farmhouse, where Frank Miller and several other neighbors were gathered on the porch. Frank had become the unofficial coordinator of the community watchdog group that monitored Meridian's activities in the region. "Any news?" Harold asked as they joined the group. Frank handed him a newspaper. "Meridian announced another round of layoffs this morning. Their stock's down almost 40% since this all began." The headline told the story. Meridian Group faces shareholder revolt, CEO under fire. Beneath it was a photo of Richard Keller looking harried as he pushed through a crowd of reporters. "They're talking about replacing Keller," Frank continued. "Investors are questioning the company's entire approach after what happened here." What had happened was something few could have predicted when Harold first refused Meridian's offer. The standoff at Townsend Farm had escalated into a national controversy that exposed not just Meridian's tactics in Riverdale County, but their pattern of operations across multiple states. The Attorney General's investigation had uncovered evidence of environmental violations, improper relationships with local officials, and potentially illegal campaign contributions. 3 county commissioners, including Green, were now facing ethics charges and possible criminal indictments. Judge Morris had been forced to recuse himself after financial connections between his family and Meridian subsidiaries came to light. The State Judicial Ethics Board was conducting a formal review of his conduct. But perhaps most significantly, the public narrative around corporate development had shifted. Communities in other states facing similar situations had begun organizing resistance using the Townsend model, combining legal challenges, media engagement, community mobilization, and political pressure. "Senator Bennett called this morning," Emma told the group. "The Senate hearings are scheduled for next month. They're looking at federal legislation to clarify and narrow the public use requirement for eminent domain." Harold had agreed to testify at those hearings, despite his discomfort with the public spotlight. His simple, straightforward defense of his land had resonated with people across the political spectrum, making him an effective advocate for reform. Pastor Mitchell arrived, carrying a folder of documents. "The Historical Society finished their assessment," he announced. "They've recommended that the original homestead portion of your farm be listed on the National Register of Historic Places due to its significance in the post-Dust Bowl agricultural restoration. Such a designation would create another layer of protection against future development attempts. Not that Meridian seemed likely to resume their efforts anytime soon. The company had announced a strategic reassessment of the Riverdale Industrial Park project 2 weeks earlier. Industry analysts widely interpreted this as a face-saving prelude to abandonment. "And there's more good news," Pastor Mitchell continued. The environmental review identified 3 endangered species in the wetlands area. The EPA is considering designating it as protected habitat. As the group discussed these developments, a black sedan approached on the driveway. Not one of Meridian's intimidating SUVs, but an official state vehicle. David Larson from the Attorney General's office emerged, carrying a leather portfolio. "Good afternoon," Larson greeted them, climbing the porch steps. "I have some information you'll want to hear." Inside Harold's kitchen, Larson spread several documents across the table. "Meridian's board of directors held an emergency meeting yesterday," he explained. "Our sources indicate they've decided to completely abandon the Riverdale project and sell off the properties they've already acquired." Emma leaned forward. "They're giving up? Completely?" Larson nodded. "The combination of legal challenges, regulatory scrutiny, negative publicity, and shareholder pressure has made the project untenable. They're cutting their losses." "What happens to the land they've already bought?" Harold asked, thinking of his neighbors who had sold their farms. "That's actually why I'm here," Larson replied. "The Attorney General has negotiated a settlement agreement as part of the ongoing investigations. Meridian will donate the acquired properties to a newly established community land trust, which will maintain them as agricultural land or natural habitat." He slid a document toward Harold. "They've also agreed to fund environmental restoration of the damaged areas, including replanting Frank's orchard. And there's a confidential compensation fund for affected property owners." Harold scanned the agreement, his mind working to process this sudden, complete victory. After months of struggle, facing an opponent with seemingly limitless resources, they had prevailed. His farm was secure, not just temporarily, but permanently. "We won," Emma said softly, voicing what everyone was thinking. "You did more than win your own battle," Larson added. "You've changed the landscape for communities across the country. The Attorney General asked me to personally thank you for your courage and persistence." That evening, after everyone had left, Harold sat alone on his porch, watching the sunset paint his fields in gold and amber. The same view his grandfather had cherished, that his father had protected, that he had nearly lost, and had ultimately saved, not just for himself, but for future generations. His phone rang. It was Rebecca Chen from the Nebraska Gazette. "Mr. Townsend, I wanted you to hear it from me first. I've just been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for my coverage of your stand against Meridian. The committee cited it as a compelling narrative that illuminated the intersection of corporate power, property rights, and community values." "Congratulations," Harold said warmly. "You deserved it. You told the truth when others wouldn't." "I had a good story to tell," Rebecca replied. "But I'm calling because I'd like to write a book about what happened, the full story, from beginning to end. With your cooperation, of course." Harold considered the request. His natural inclination was to return to privacy, to tend his fields away from public attention. But he also recognized that their story carried important lessons that deserved to be shared. "On one condition," he said finally. "Make sure people understand this wasn't just about me. It was about all of us standing together for something that mattered." After ending the call, Harold walked out to the family cemetery beneath the old oak tree. Sarah's headstone stood among those of his parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, generations of Townsends who had worked this land, loved it, and passed it on. "We did it, Sarah," he said quietly. "We protected our home." The wind rustled through the oak leaves above, a sound that had accompanied every generation of his family. Harold had never considered himself extraordinary, just a farmer doing what he believed was right. But sometimes, he reflected, ordinary people standing firmly on principle could accomplish extraordinary things. The land would remain in Townsend hands, and someday Emma's children or grandchildren might farm it, or perhaps find other ways to honor the legacy it represented. The land would endure, as it always had, through seasons of plenty and hardship alike. As darkness fell, Harold turned back toward the farmhouse his grandfather had built, where lights now glowed warm and welcoming in the windows. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, tonight he could rest, knowing that some things, integrity, community, justice, still mattered more than money and power. Some things, as he had said from the beginning, simply weren't for sale.